Good morning. I'm David Plazas, the Opinion and Engagement Director for the USA Today Network Tennessee, here at the Tennessean in Nashville, Tennessee. We're delighted to have our editorial board members from across the state network interview former Nashville Mayor Karl Dean about his run for governor. He's the Democratic candidate for governor today. Thank you very much, Mayor Dean. And before we begin with questions, let's ask the editorial board members to please introduce themselves.
Good morning. I'm Michael Anastasi. I'm editor of the Tennessean and vice president of news for the USA Today Network Tennessee.
I'm Maria DeVrain, executive editor at the Tennessean.
I'm Jack McElroy, executive editor of the Knoxville News Sentinel, part of the USA Today Network Tennessee.
Mayor Dean, tell us who you are, what you stand for, and what misconceptions, if any, there might be about you.
Well, I think my background is been one in public service. I came to Nashville in 1978 to go to law school at Vanderbilt. Met my future wife in law school, who's a Nashville native. And I've spent my career largely in public service. I was the public defender in that office for about 15 or 16 years, and then 9 of those years I was the elected defender. I think one of the things that people don't understand maybe about me is how important that was to me in terms of my development as a person and how about what I learned in that job. I learned obviously a lot about criminal justice and the need for fairness and the need to make sure the system works. But I also was around alcoholism, mental illness, drug addiction, poverty. And it gave me a real sense of the importance of education, that my clients were overwhelmingly, the adult clients were high school dropouts, probably 95%. My juvenile clients were leaving school 12, 13, 14 years of age. No one was doing anything to keep them in school or to get them back into school. And that gave me this real sense of just the tragedy of sort of knowing how things were going to end at that early of an age, that it wasn't going to end good. And that there were so many things that we could have done along the way to change things, and we didn't. So that work, 15 years doing that work is, by most standards, is a long time. I got a lot out of it. I thought I was helping people every day. I then became the city's law director in '99, which gave me sort of a real insight into how the city operated, and plus the connections with the city with state government and the federal government. And then served as mayor from '07 to '15. And as I tell people, I had 2 very different terms. My first term was responding to the Great Recession and then also responding to the flood. But we were able to move forward on our things that we cared about in our agenda, which was public education, public safety, and economic development. It was that time we built the convention center, that we were very aggressive about economic development for the city. And then my second term, we came out of the recession strong. Tourism, hospitality took off. Economic development success in terms of recruiting business and retaining business. And the boom began, which continues to this day. And we weren't rolling in money, but we were able to do a lot for schools. We increased their budget by about 37%, put over $620 million in the capital programs, and moved starting teacher pay from 30th in the state to 3rd. So those were kind of my values and what I wanted to get done. I think what people should know about me is that I'm a person who likes to solve problems, who likes to work to move a state or a city forward and to make it a better place to live. Less partisan than I think a lot of people in public life. It's more about results to me.
Mayor Dean, why and how does political experience matter in assuming the role of governor?
Well, I think it certainly matters, and it's helpful to have a knowledge of how to work with people toward ultimately doing things in the political context that will move the state forward. I mean, I think you have to understand that not everything you want you can just do. I think sometimes people who come in from the business sector, particularly at a CEO level, think that you make a decision, you set down an order, and it's going to happen. I think you've got to work to bring people together. You got to try to reach consensus. You got to understand the roles that different parts of the government play and be respectful of that. I think that's important. I think one of the most important things that you can do in politics or in government is to listen. I think when I look back at things that happened during my career, good and bad, the key element is listening and knowing that you should listen to other people's opinions. And then I think it's understanding how government works. Government is a lot more complex than people realize. So I think government experience historically has been important, and I would argue for Tennessee that we have certainly benefited in the last two governors having a former mayor. I think both Phil Bredesen and Bill Haslam came into the office with the same background I have, and I think we've benefited from that, understanding local government, but also understanding state government.
So to your first point, the General Assembly will be a Republican assembly by a long shot. How do you govern successfully given that?
A couple ways. First, I think you have to go in understanding that whatever you do, you're going to have to reach an agreement. You're going to have to reach out across the aisle and try to find areas of compromise, areas to work together on. And I think that's easiest when you identify things that are actually going to be beneficial to the state and that are important for the state. And the approaches to the legislature would not be one of, let's do this because the governor needs it or the Dean administration needs it. Let's do this because the state needs it. This is going to move our state forward, and let's reason together, talk together, and figure out how we can get this done. You know, our state has a history of having governors of one party and the legislature of another. You know, certainly back in the 80s, and we had Lamar Alexander was governor, who was a Republican, and you had a Democratic legislature. Phil Bredesen was second term, was a Democrat with a Republican legislature. Both, I think, most people would agree, were very successful governors. At any given point around this country, you've got governors of one party and legislatures of another. Probably the two governors who are getting the most attention right now nationally would be Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, who's a Democrat, and Montana would be very Republican like Tennessee. And on the other side, you got Governor Baker of Massachusetts, who's, by all accounts, is doing a great job in Massachusetts. He's a Republican, and you've got a very Democratic legislature in Massachusetts. So it can be done, and I think it's actually good for the state because it restores the balance. And I think one of the things that we need is, you know, if the legislature sometimes considers things that I might, and I think a lot of people in Tennessee might consider going too far, you want a governor that's going to be a check a little bit on that and not have a lot of things happen that we might not want to have happen here.
Thank you.
So when we look around the state, there are a couple urban areas, obviously Nashville from where you've been mayor, but there's sometimes this tension between the rural counties and the larger cities. So how would you bridge that divide, and what would you do to talk with those rural counties about the challenges and opportunities that you would bring as governor?
Yeah. You know, actually, you know, the more this campaign has gone along, I think that the rural-urban divide is less of an issue than I did going into it, because I think, for instance, the issues I'm talking about in the campaign and focusing on, education, healthcare, economic opportunity, those issues, I think, are felt more deeply in rural areas than in urban areas. You know, I can tell you, as a mayor and being familiar with the way Nashville operates and other cities in Tennessee, that education is a critical issue. I know that healthcare is an issue here, and I know that we're always concerned about giving people a chance to succeed and to see good growth. But when you look at rural Tennessee, you know, education there, and I understand this a lot better now, having gone through all over the state, is because of, in many places, almost non-existent sales tax revenue, and because of almost no political capacity to raise the property tax. They have no ability to do any enhancements or any special things for education to make it better or to supplement it. That's a major concern that they have. In terms of health care, that's sort of ground zero. I mean, we're hurt by the Medicaid expansion decision here and in Memphis. Region 1 hospital in Memphis is hurt. General's hurt. Every hospital in Tennessee is hurt by it. But in rural Tennessee, small town Tennessee, that's where the hospitals are closing. I mean, for them, it is not a theoretical conversation. It's 11 hospitals that have closed. And then I think with the economy, you know, most urban areas in Tennessee are booming. You know, certainly Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga are knocking it out of the ballpark right now. I think there's a lot of really good things that are happening in Memphis. and a lot of good things happening all around the state. But there are rural districts where they're not, the poverty levels aren't what, or the unemployment rates aren't what they were during the height of or the depths of the Great Recession, but they're still high, and they're still recovering from the job losses like the apparel industry that left in the 80s and 90s. Those jobs haven't been replaced. So I think my message resonates across the state, and I think, though, that urban and rural interests are pretty much aligned.
Thank you.
Mayor, you referenced the success of Governor Haslam's administration, but I'm sure you have some ideas of your own that directions that you would like to take the state. Can you tell us what your priorities would be going into the 2019 legislative session and beyond, and what programs of Governor Haslam you would want to continue and what you might want to discontinue?
Yeah. Well, I think where Governor Haslam and I certainly work together, and where I think he's done some really good things, I don't want to make it limited in any way, but I think he's had a very good positive role in education. I don't agree with everything that was done, but I do think he set out to be an education governor, and he succeeded in doing that. And I think Phil Bredesen before him did the same. And it's critical that the next governor do the same thing in terms of making education a priority, be willing to fund it, and to be willing to look at things in different ways. I'm a big believer and be very supportive of the Tennessee Promise. I think obviously you got to monitor it. You got to make sure we're getting the graduation rates that we want. I think the programs for technical education are also vital. I would be supportive of them. I would look, in addition to what he did, I would look for more ways for us to offer scholarships, state scholarships to four-year universities, whether they be state universities or private within the state of Tennessee. I think that would be good for our state. So those are programs I would continue. I would obviously have to evaluate and to see where we are on terms of the testing issue that is sort of dominating all discussions of education in the last month or so. I mean, we've got to get that right, and I think we want to be in a position where we know we've got to be able to test, we've got to be able to do it by computers. We don't want the tests to become a threatening thing for teachers. We don't want it to be something that is seen as punitive. It ought to be something that is about how we advance people's careers, how we train them better, how they do better working with students. I think it's now in a position where there's so much suspicion about it that and teachers aren't certain about it. They think it's being used against them in many cases. That's got to change. And that can be done, I think. So education, I'd continue with that as a high priority. I would put a lot of attention in terms of economic development on the parts of the state that really need it. I don't think for a minute that Governor Haslam hasn't tried to do that. But I do think, we have to recognize that it's the small towns, the rural areas that are struggling, and we got to try to help them. I think we need to acknowledge that the poverty level in Memphis, particularly with young African Americans, somewhere around 47%, we should, as a state, to say that's unacceptable and take action to get that changed. And that would involve not only economic development energies, but also educational. I would also say we as a state need to recognize that Memphis faces unique challenges in terms of economic development because of its location. When I was, we had a very successful run here when I was doing economic development in Nashville. I never thought about Kentucky or Alabama, no offense to either state, but they're far enough away that they weren't, people weren't leaving here to go there, that people weren't commuting from there for the most part. And in Memphis, it's different. I think every day with northern Mississippi and Arkansas, Memphis is competing to keep its residents, to maintain its tax base, and to attract jobs. And the key thing for Memphis going forward is to make sure that tax base is maintained and that we're attracting more business there. And the state needs to be more aggressive and just say it. We're going to win more there, and that's what we need to do. I think in West Tennessee, in rural Tennessee, West Tennessee, you've got 15 out of 21 counties there are losing population. That's bad. When you're losing population, again, you're losing tax base, you're losing the ability to fund education, you're losing your ability to fund public safety, and it kind of builds on itself. I mean, the great news in Nashville, I think, for us is, somebody who's been here for 35 years plus, is our kids are coming back. That's a great feeling when you live someplace where your kids want to come back to. And I'd love to see that happen all over the state. So those are the things that come to mind. And then obviously I agree with Governor Haslam on Medicaid expansion. I think that is, to me, education is the long-term biggest priority for the state. I would say healthcare is second, but I think Medicaid expansion is an immediate need, an immediate almost crisis that we have to deal with. And so I would work on that beginning first day in office. And we need to get that done. And I think Governor Haslam did a great job of negotiating a better deal for Tennessee than other states. It is a very reasonable proposal, and we need to try to get that accomplished as soon as possible because we're suffering as a result of that.
You mentioned Memphis quite a bit, so we have a question from our colleagues at the Commercial Appeal. The takedown of the Confederate monuments in Memphis last year and the state legislature's strident response raises questions about local control. To what extent should local municipalities be able to make decisions without state intervention on issues that chiefly affect their cities?
Well, I have a lot of familiarity with this issue as a mayor. You know, the law is basically that the counties and the cities and towns, particularly the cities and towns, have the authority that is given to them by the legislature. Counties are a little bit different, but cities, that's basically the law. But that means that the state legislature has got to show wisdom and judgment in making decisions how it interferes with local government. You know, local government, I think particularly our Republican friends have been saying for generations, it does the best job of knowing what the citizens' needs and what the needs are of the community, and we should honor that. You know, there are clearly some things like criminal law that needs to be the same across the state. There are certainly certain regulatory schemes, particularly I can think of a variety of them, but education would be one. There's some others where you got to have uniform laws just to make the system work. But it would seem to me that a local government should have control over its historic monuments and what goes in its parks. You know, the understanding of the people of Memphis about what they want in their park I think is better than what the rest of the state knows. The rest of the state is not really aware of the issues. I'm very sympathetic to what Memphis went through because here it was the anniversary of Martin Luther King's death. It was a moment when the eyes of the nation, if not the world, were going to be on Memphis. And you have a majority African-American city where people are walking past statues to heroes of the Confederacy. Some of these monuments were created not in 1870 or 1880, but in the 1960s, around the time that major civil rights legislation was being considered in Congress, the Voting Rights Act. And so they were put up arguably with a different message in mind. And whatever the history is, I think the people of Memphis can say, we want to change. And I don't think it was appropriate for the legislature then to punish the entire city in that way. It was just a wrong move. So I would, in terms of that particular issue, making decisions about what goes in state parks, what goes in a courthouse, that's a local issue.
Related to that, Nashville's been preempted at least 3 times in the last few years, be it for affordable housing, the inclusionary zoning, for example, for short-term rentals, and then also for the charter amendment related to giving preferential treatment to local workers. How would you work with the legislature to ensure that local and state interests are balanced?
Well, I think, you know, ideally in all these issues, you know, and that's where this is where the politics or experience in government comes into play. You can try to avoid a confrontation and, you know, have an understanding of what each are thinking. You know, some issues it may be impossible. Maybe the monument issue is one that was impossible. But I think in terms of the issues such as the zoning, you know, it would be incumbent upon the local government perhaps to have more conversations with the legislature about what they're trying to do and ease their concern. But again, you know, zoning to me is pretty much a local issue. I mean, zoning is by its very nature, even if you look at it in Nashville, people defer a lot to the council member even in saying that those zoning issues should be made, you know, at the neighborhood level, and they don't need to be made at the state level. And again, this is where I think a lot of these disputes, particularly around these zoning issues, are kind of driven by ideology. And I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think, you know, you got to be practical and pragmatic, and you look at neighborhoods, and you look what people want, and you look at what the law provides in the local government, and if it's legal, then the state shouldn't preempt it.
Returning to West Tennessee for just a moment, the Megasite in Madison County represents the best chance for that part of the state to draw a transformative project with potentially thousands of jobs and the power to draw additional companies and suppliers. It lacks a sewer line and is incomplete today. How would you work to complete that Megasite, and what's your strategy to draw a potential tenant?
Well, I think, number one, I support the Megasite being completed and being made shovel-ready. I mean, we have spent a lot of money to get it to where it is now, and I do think it's a project that will pay off in the end. So we've got to work through the water issues, and we got to get the site ready. And we know just from recent history that there have been companies that have been interested and walked away because it's not ready. So that needs to be resolved. I think we'll be able to attract companies there. I have a real sense of confidence that our state is a tremendously attractive place to do business. I mean, it's our sound fiscal management. It's a generally positive business climate here, low taxes. If you look at the recent federal tax laws, people in other states, particularly in the Northeast and in the Midwest, are going to want to be in Tennessee. And I think long-term, the issue in Tennessee, and the Megasite's covered by this, you know, incentives are going to play a role, and I've worked with incentives, and I understand their role. But I think the long-term, the big issue in Tennessee is going to be: are we going to have the workforce ready to do those jobs? You know, and you know, the company that was looking at the Megasite went to Huntsville. I think Huntsville, Alabama, had a lot of workforce attractions to them too, which I think hurt us. So to make the Megasite work, that involves having great education, great technical and vocational education in addition to college education. But it also means having a hospital. I mean, it shouldn't be lost on folks that the hospital in that area closed, and you're not going to get major investment until that problem's fixed. You know, I think you can make it succeed, but part of that's going to be getting a hospital there. So all those things, all those life things, got to be fixed. But you know, for the whole state and for that area, workforce development is the key, and putting money into education and putting money into the future, that's the right bet. It'll pay off for our state. The only way we lose, I think, is if we don't make the workforce development investments we need to make.
Thank you.
So you've touched on workforce development, and earlier in our conversation you talked about the importance of Medicaid expansion and how that's a crisis. So we know Tennessee as a whole, the economy is thriving, but there are those issues such as health care or wages and education that are hurting people that are impoverished. So what would you do to help turn the tide for those people that are the working poor or the less educated?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. I mean, number one, I do think the only real answer is job creation in conjunction with better education. I mean, there is no easy way to snap your fingers and say that problem gets solved. I mean, clearly we need people to be paid more. I mean, the minimum wage here, which is really the federal minimum wage, it's not a wage that families can live on. But if we're going to actually move citizens out of poverty and we're going to actually create an environment where everybody has a chance to get ahead, then that's going to involve having more jobs created, better jobs, and that to me it hinges on education. That was always my premise as mayor, that you know, you get education right, you know, that's going to help you with public safety, and that's going to help you with economic development, and then vice versa. And you got to do all three at the same time. And so while you're building the economy, while you're bringing companies here and keeping companies here, you got to be doing the education piece, and you got to do them together. And that's why education should always be our top priority. That should be, and what I vowed to the people of Tennessee is I'll do it just like I was mayor. You know, during the Great Recession, during the flood, we couldn't add a lot, but I didn't cut education. I looked for every way I could to help it, but I wouldn't cut anything there. And then when we came out of the recession and we had the boom, that's where I put most of the money, and that's what I would do at the state level, because that's betting on the future.
Thank you.
Tennessee has done some things to address the opioid addiction problem, but it continues to be devastating in our state. Recent figures revealed that last year in Knox and Anderson County, overdose deaths were about one a day, and it's affecting across the state. Governor Haslam was able to direct some funds toward that and come up with plans involving expansion of drug courts and some other initiatives. What kinds of steps would you seek to take, and what kind of resources would you want to apply to that problem?
Well, I think Governor Haslam was on the right track. I think it was good that he put more treatment dollars in, and the legislature and the governor worked together to get a control on prescription abuse. I think that's key. I think the treatment dollars are not enough. I think we got to be doing more there. You know, an opportunity is with Medicaid expansion. I mean, one of the things that I would note that occurred in Virginia, which did Medicaid expansion this year and has actually, I think, benefited from it a lot, is they've been able to do more in terms of responding to the opioid addiction crisis. I think Tennessee was in a position, because of our failure to do Medicaid expansion, where this crisis, which has been around for a long time and only become a crisis in people's eyes until recently, we weren't able to respond as fast to because we didn't have the treatment facilities and we didn't have the money to do that. And I think that put us in a bad situation. So that is another huge argument for doing Medicaid expansion. You know, it's clear we don't have enough resources. I'll just talk about Renewal House, which is an organization here that deals with pregnant women with addiction and with women with young children. They do a great job, nonprofit, and they've got a 50-person waiting list, and it's the only such program in Middle Tennessee. So that sort of crisis, that issue is reoccurring all across the state. I think we got to monitor how the control of prescriptions works. I mean, that really is working closely with pharmacists and with the medical profession. There's going to be a lot of nervousness about whether people are going to be able to get the access that they need for pain control. But I agree with what the legislature did. We just got to monitor it and make sure we don't have any unintended consequences from that. I think there's a public education portion of this that you know, we need to continue to work on. And then I think there's a law enforcement part. I mean, I think treatment is the ultimate answer, and I'm a big advocate for drug courts. I worked to help start the drug courts here when I was younger as a public defender. But there are people who are making a living out of selling fentanyl and heroin and other things, and that is clearly a crime, and it's clearly causing untold misery and suffering for people in our state and should be treated as a crime, and law enforcement needs to be supported.
If I could follow up with a somewhat related question, how do you feel about medical marijuana? Is that anything that you would support as that legislation comes up if you're elected?
Yeah, I would support it. The reason being that I think I've heard enough, and that the medical profession believes it has a role to play in treatment and pain management. And I think if the doctors are saying this is a tool they need and it can be, you know, prescribed, that we shouldn't stand in the way of giving people relief from pain and suffering. And so I would be in favor of that.
The Tennessee Housing and Development Agency came out with a report earlier this year talking about a need of 133,000 units of housing for Tennesseans across the state. It's about 31,000 in Nashville itself. Even amidst this boom, some have characterized this as a crisis, and obviously it's not unusual to Tennessee or to Nashville. How would you help address the housing needs of the residents across both urban and rural areas, and do you believe it is a crisis?
Well, I think, you know, certainly Nashville is sort of the poster child for affordable housing. There's a lot of needs here. And I think what the governor could do, what the state can do, is work with the Tennessee housing folks to try to make more capital or funds available to have housing projects. I mean, there are different needs in different places, but there are certainly affordable issues in almost every major city, and I think in some rural communities too. And so I think we could do a lot more. There's room for expansion there, and it hasn't been much. I think the housing folks in that department have done a good job, but I think we need to give them more resources and work with them. And I think that's how I'd approach it.
And the reason I asked the crisis question is that there's some debate over, obviously this is not the foreclosure crisis of 2007, 2008, but there's an affordability issue. Some have described it as that, just to get some clarity in terms of where your thinking is on that.
Well, I think I don't want to use the word crisis necessarily. I think it is certainly a major issue that has huge ramifications for the state's long-term prosperity and the prosperity of Middle Tennessee specifically. Now, how you address that, I think it's obviously you need to have more housing. You need to be putting money into developing affordable housing. You also need to be looking at the transit side of this. I don't think it's a one-issue thing. I mean, if you have better transit in urban areas, you're going to be able to get people to areas where housing is going to be less expensive, and they'll be able to get to work. It just gives more options. It makes the market level out more. So, I mean, I would say it's a crisis, certainly for the people who are going through it, and it's something that requires a government response now, not in the distant future, and something I would work on in my first months in office.
How would you work to ensure that schools and students are safe in the wake of the mass shootings that we've seen across our country?
Well, I was mayor when Sandy Hook happened, and the first thing we did was work with the schools to move up a lot of capital funding to do basic improvements in school security. I think that's key around the state, and then I would work to have more resource officers present in schools to ensure safety, and that would be a high priority for me. I do not believe that we should be arming our teachers. I don't think that will result in more safety, and I think it's something the teachers don't want and look at that as something that might be dangerous, in fact. But I think we have to acknowledge that we have to do more, and I think having resource officers is the way to go.
Thank you.
In the wake of the Waffle House shooting here in Nashville, the Tennessean has focused quite a bit on mental health issues and the lack of available beds when someone's in a crisis. Also, the cost of services. Sometimes private insurance will pay for immediate care, but maybe not long-term counseling. And can you talk to us, if you were governor, what you would do to try to address the mental health issues facing not only Nashville but the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a whole series of mental health issues that affect the state in a variety of ways, whether it's violence that we saw at the Waffle House, or what more commonly is people with mental illness who are not getting the treatment they need, they're not getting the care they need, and in many cases don't have a place to live and are homeless. And that would, I think, tie into the crisis that we have in terms of housing. I would say homelessness is a crisis. And I think the state, that issue comes up as I've been around the state, and it comes up largely in the urban context, but it comes up in smaller towns too. And I do think the state, it's almost been handled exclusively as a local issue, where there's been, and the local governments have done some creative things and worked with the faith community and with nonprofits. But I do think it's time really for the state to look at the role it plays in homelessness and the role it can play in helping localities address that issue. It certainly ties into the mental illness issue too, because I think a lot of people who end up being homeless are people who might have been treated in a mental hospital before. And I'm not advocating, people get a little sentimental thinking about the days when everybody was put in a hospital who was mentally ill. But there were some terrible civil liberties issues there, and the facilities weren't all that great. So, and the investments I think we need to be making are finding good housing. I think it's a great opportunity to work with the nonprofits and others to get that accomplished. I think we have to look at mental illness about where we are in terms of overall spending on that, whether we should be doing more, whether there are facilities that we can look at perhaps bringing back online in a different way and fashion. But I'm definitely open to all of that. I mean, I think one of the things that have come from the past year, 2 years of shootings, whether it's been in Tennessee or whether it's been in other parts of the state, it's just this sense that we got to start thinking about how we keep weapons out of the hands of dangerous people. I mean, I think we can all agree that no matter what our position is on all the issues related to weapons, we don't want dangerous people having weapons that can be used to hurt other people. And so that issue, I think, needs to be examined and actually probably looked at very carefully in the next legislative session.
As a news organization, we are very concerned about issues of government transparency, and I think the citizens of Tennessee also are very concerned about this issue. This past year, the Comptroller's Office did an examination, found that well, it's now up to about 560 exemptions to the state's Public Records Act, and a interim legislative study committee was established to look into those exemptions, and they're in the process of doing that. A lot of times these exemptions and issues of secrecy in government involve balancing privacy issues, and many times those are very clear choices. But there's also been instances where this has come into economic development questions, where companies don't want to share the details of their investments and the commitments that they make. Could you speak to your philosophy on open government and how you might advocate for transparency?
Yeah, well, I think government should be open and transparent, and this is a good example of difference between local and state government, and where state government can learn something from local government. You know, under state law, the state exempts itself from certain open records processes, which they don't exempt local government, and so we pretty much what local government does is open to the public. Certainly, we couldn't do and haven't done in my time any sort of economic development program and have an agreement with a company that is not public. I mean, it is voted on by the Metro Council, it's voted on by whatever other boards would have to vote on it, and it is a document that is made available to whoever requests it. You know, there may be a few areas where there's some legitimate public safety concern or otherwise that you would have to look at very carefully. But in general, as much as the government might not like it, I've worked in an environment where you pretty much get what you ask for. When you want the documents, you get them. Open meetings in local government are much broader than it is in state government, and I think we've been able to operate successfully. And so I would be a strong advocate for open government, both in meetings and in records.
One major exemption involves the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, that law enforcement agencies, local ones, once they close an investigation, those investigative files are open. For the TBI, they have a forever exemption that their investigative files remain closed forever. Would you be supportive of re-examining that exemption and perhaps coming up with ways to open some of the TBI's investigative files after investigations are closed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would definitely be willing to look at it. I mean, I do think in law enforcement you get into an interesting field. You don't want innocent people hurt because their name appears in a file and that file didn't result in any sort of charges or anything happening. But again, I would err on the side of being more open, but that would be an area I would certainly be interested in and studying and seeing what the best practice is there.
Mayor Dean, I have a two-part question on the IMPROVE Act, which is the law that passed on roads, infrastructure, and transit, and I'll ask the first one and afterwards ask the second part. The first part is that the transit referendum in Nashville failed 2-1, in many cases because voters said they wanted a regional plan. Would you go to the legislature to tweak the IMPROVE Act so that referendums could be held beyond just county or city limits?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, what I think about where we are in transit is I do think we need a much stronger leadership component from the state in dealing with transit. I think from my experience, I helped create the mayor's caucus and worked on all these issues. And the mayors in Middle Tennessee have gotten along very well, have worked hard to work together to come up with plans to do transit solutions. And at some point, you reach a point where, in terms of timing things, in terms of funding or approvals and planning, where you need something. You need the state to help. You need the state to help get it done across county lines. And I think the state's got to play that role. And one of the things would be an option that would be out there is to have a multi-county referendum. And if you're looking at funding, I think the state should help. I don't think the state pays for everything, but the state definitely has to play a leadership role. I mean, regionalism is going to be key to the economic success of the state in all parts of the state. But to make it happen, the state's got to be a player, and that's got to happen in the near future. And I do believe that the next obvious step to me would be that I think people recognize in Middle Tennessee and in Nashville that when they think about transit problems, they think of some of the crowded streets, but they think more of the interstate than anything else. And if you're going to get something done, that's probably the next likely step, and that's going to take multi-county effort, and it's going to take state leadership.
And related to that, the IMPROVE Act essentially pays for the backlog through 2030. It doesn't necessarily pay for future roads needs. How would you pay for that?
Well, number one, you got to figure out what's the local share and what the state's going to be doing, and hopefully there's a significant federal share in this. All of those are, nothing's written in stone at this point. I think it's vitally important to pay for infrastructure. I was a supporter of the IMPROVE Act, and I certainly recognize that we waited, I think, too long from the last time that more money was made available for infrastructure investments to when it was done just recently. And this most recent uptick is not going to take us 30 more years. It's not going to be able to fund the future. So I think you look at a variety of different sources. There may be things you can do within a region. I do think we got to keep our roads up in every part of the state, in rural communities and urban and suburban, and they're key economic development tools in rural communities. So the gas tax is something that I think is going to have to be reviewed periodically, and my commitment is not to fall behind on infrastructure investment. Again, it's about the future, and if there's no easy way to do it, at some point you're going to have to pay for it. But if you don't pay for it, you're going to pay a lot more down the road because you're going to have to make up for all of that neglected maintenance and everything else, and you're not going to get the same growth that you want. So, we'll look at all options, but I will support infrastructure investment and having the funds there to do it.
Earlier, you touched on how Shelby County and Memphis have the state's largest concentration of people living in poverty. Could you share with us strategies or specific proposals you might employ to improve the quality of life there?
I think the main thing that the state can do to help. I mean, there's a variety of ideas that could be out there in terms of how you aid in the reduction of poverty, and there may be grant potential and other ways we can work with nonprofits and work with the county and the city of Memphis. But what I think the state can do is do a whole lot more in terms of economic development. Understand that the need for a strong, robust private sector economy that's creating jobs, creating opportunities, and creating revenue that allows Memphis to invest in the things it needs to invest in, which I would say public safety, education. And then I think we have to recognize that we need to be doing more there in terms of education. I think we need to be doing more in a lot of different places, but I think we certainly do in Memphis. And the relationship between poverty and education, to me, that brings it all home. I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about my experiences in life. Young people, if they don't have a chance to get a good education, they're not going to get out of poverty. And that means having probably more services involved. I mean, in terms of working with kids who come from a background where maybe there is need for more social services, more supports, then we should provide that. I don't think we can ignore it. I don't think we can say that this is not the state's problem. I think it's all of our problem.
Thank you.
Sticking with education, in one of your campaign ads, you talk a lot about limitless libraries.
Yep.
Can you share with our viewers today what that concept is and how you would implement it and what it would do to help literacy across the state?
Yes. I just was down in McNairy County this week, where they were starting limitless libraries down there, and they asked me to come by. Limitless libraries is basically this idea that Donna Nicely and I worked on, and then our current librarian has run with too, is this idea that we should break the walls down between our school libraries, which, as you know, are a different budget and different decision makers, and our general government, where our public library is. And our public library, which, because of lots of work by people over the last 30 years, are some of the best in the country. And so we went down this path of the idea, first, of ordering books together to have sort of savings in volume purchases. And then we kind of got to the point of, why don't we just share all the books? And so that any kid in a Nashville public school can ask for a library book or a movie or music and get it delivered to them the next day or the day after. And there's literally thousands of books and movies and stuff circulating all through the city on any given day. It's increased the number of kids with library cards and increased the circulation coming out of our public libraries dramatically. And then in addition to that, we had this concept that what we wanted to see was that the library should be the best room in the school. That, our public schools, like almost every public school in America, has neglected their libraries for 30, 40 years. And the libraries were not the best rooms, and the books were ancient, not in the valuable sense, just ancient books. And we needed to ramp that up. And so we worked to redesign the libraries into, whether it's for elementary kids or high school kids, different designs, but to make them really attractive. We worked with, and that money came from the city budget, not from the school budget, because the schools had their own economic needs, and this was sort of something I was fixated on. And philanthropy. We had some major gifts that were given to us in matching programs. So it's worked. And so what I was witnessing the other day was a school system that had developed, had the computer stuff in place where they could have the kids ordering books from the public library, set up a mechanism where they'd be delivered every week. And then we're in the design process and the fundraising process of redesigning their elementary school library. And that's where they were going to start at this elementary school and then take it system-wide. I would love to see the state help on that in terms of, I think literacy skills, being able to read by third grade, being proficient is vital. I think love of books, love of learning, lifelong learning is key. If the state can play a role in helping make that happen, I think, through grants and aiding communities. And it's going to be hard for communities that are smaller to do it, but then you can think bigger after a while. You can think then regionally, where you can order, everybody gets what they need if you're doing it on a regional basis. Cooperation is kind of the key, and that's what you break down those walls that are artificially there in government and say, let's work together. So that was the school system working with the general government, working with the nonprofit community. And it created, that's the thing I'm proudest of as mayor. I'd say if people say, what about the convention center or the amphitheater or whatever, I'd say this. I just love it.
Thank you.
Over the past year or so, there has been a lot of movement in the structure of higher education in Tennessee. Changes in the governing structure of the Board of Regents schools, recently changes in the Board of Trustees of the University of Tennessee, and just recently, Randy Boyd, a recent candidate for governor, was put forth as an interim president of the University of Tennessee system with reference to vision that he could bring to further shape the University of Tennessee and its mission to the future. What are your views about where higher education needs to go? Do you see any kinds of structural changes that you would like to see, or particular developments of the missions of our higher education institutions?
I think I don't know that I would advocate for any immediate structural changes, particularly in terms of governance. I mean, Governor Haslam has done these things relatively recently. I think part of the UT board, I don't think it's even full yet, and there's a whole learning curve that they're going through, which is, I think, part of this transition where Randy has come in to serve in the interim. So I would certainly monitor that and watch how it's going and see if that needs to be tinkered with, but I think it needs to be given its chance. I mean, my perception of where we need to be is, higher education is something we need to support strongly. I think there's a lot of good news around the state, particularly, I can point to a whole variety of schools that I've visited, Martin, Chattanooga, MTSU, others that are really doing great and play enormous roles in their communities. I think the UT Knoxville ought to be supported, and my vision of that would be that in time you want to create that into a university system that rivals Georgia or rivals Texas. I mean, that's a lofty goal, but I think that's possible, and I think there's a lot of strong attributes there. And it's in our state's interest to do that, to be, being that sort of research-oriented university that attracts people from around the country and keeps students here wanting to go to those schools would be a wonderful thing. And so I'd be very supportive of it. I think it's, obviously as you're building K through 12 or pre-K through 12, you want our university systems to be similarly excellent. And I think we can do that.
A very big issue right now is the issue of tariffs, and if elected governor, you'll have a role in trade policy and foreign policy. We know that Japan is the largest foreign direct investment country here in Tennessee. There's a great relationship with Canada, but these tariffs potentially threaten certain industries in Tennessee, like automotive, agriculture. How would you address these particular issues, and how do you see your role in working with the White House to ensure that Tennessee is as least harmed as possible?
Well, I think, clearly there's a lot of concern about agriculture, autos. I think home building with Canada's in terms of tariffs there. I think the governor's role is to look out for the state of Tennessee and to frankly and honestly but respectfully state the opinion of the governor representing the state about what the tariffs would mean to our economy, and answer questions and provide information, and work with our congressional representatives to make sure our voice is heard. I'm by nature, not that the governor gets to decide these issues, but I believe in free trade. I mean, I'm sort of a person who's believed that sort of worked, and long term that's where we should be. That protection ultimately doesn't help anybody and makes you less competitive down the road. And that's the direction I'd like to see national policy go in, but I realize I'm running for governor of Tennessee and not for something else, and so that's where I am. But at the same time, the governor has an opportunity too, is you can think through as you're doing economic development, maybe try to think strategically as to how you can protect the state if there is if more walls go up around the world in terms of trade, how we can attract investments here that will allow us to be a little bit insulated from that. I mean, one of the things Tennessee is, I certainly noticed it when I was mayor, is we felt the recession, and it was hard here. We were well over 9% unemployment, and everything kind of just stopped. But at the same time, our economy was diverse enough and strong enough in some areas that it wasn't as bad as some places were hit. And we were able to come out of it, I think, earlier and went into it a little bit later than a lot of places. That should be kind of the goal for the state. And you got to always think about diversification. I think that's always key. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket.
Are there any final questions before we get to our concluding one? Okay, Mayor Dean, do you pledge to be civil in this campaign, and what does that mean to you? And how will you show it in this campaign, and how you deal with your opponent?
Well, yes, I do pledge to be civil. To me, civility in the campaign is treating your opponent with respect, not personalizing issues, not trying to question in some unreasonable fashion anybody's motivations. I don't think civility requires us not to discuss issues. I think that, actually a campaign, I think one of the most important things the campaign does is allows the voters to see what the different positions of the candidates are on various issues. And I think stating those, frankly, in a polite, reasonable way is what people want and people need from candidates. I don't think you're going to get any other way in which the issues get aired or the debate takes place unless people are willing to do that. But I can just point to my record as a candidate over the years. I don't think I've ever been the first to start throwing stones, and I don't think I will be in this election either. I don't like it, and I'm happier discussing ideas, and I think that the ideas we have are strong enough to carry the day.
Indeed, thank you very much. On behalf of the editorial boards of the USA Today Network Tennessee, we wish you the best, and thank you very much.